Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is the second event in Dragon's hosted Sustainability in Manufacturing Earth Day Virtual Summit. As everyone's kind of getting settled in and situated, we'll give you a few moments to do that. We have a poll to kick things off to get a bit more information about the folks that are on our call today. So if you're just joining us, feel free to take a few minutes to fill out that poll. We have a fantastic set of panelists joining us today from multiple countries and are excited to talk for this first panel on the broader topic of environmentally friendly materials. So again, giving folks a few minutes to get settled in. You probably have seen that poll pop up on your screen. If you don't mind filling that out in terms of letting us know what your interest is in sustainability and sustainable practices, and then what your current role in your current company is related to sustainability and or manufacturing. All right, giving folks a couple more minutes to, or seconds, I suppose, to fill that out. Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for joining us. How today's panel is going to work. My name is Kata Henning. I am with Dragon Innovation. I am our Director of Business Development based in Seattle, Washington. I'm joined by 4 fantastic panelists today. Would love to start the conversation today with a round of introductions so you know to whom you're speaking and their areas of expertise, particularly as relate to topics of sustainability and manufacturing. When you all signed up for today's webinar and panel, we got a great initial round of questions from attendees in terms of the areas you're interested in learning more about. So we're going to use that to spark a good conversation among our panelists. We'll take about 45 minutes to do all of that, and then the last 10 to 15 minutes of the panel, I want to open it up to Q&A. So for a bit of logistics overview, at the bottom of your screen, you should see there's both a chat function and a Q&A. We're going to save your questions for the end, but if our conversation sparks something you really want to follow up on, you can submit those questions at any point in time. I'd probably use the Q&A module for that, whereas chat can kind of be an ongoing conversational module if you'd like. So again, my name's Kata Henning. I am with Dragon Innovation. I'm our Director of Business Development, and would love to start with a round of introductions from our esteemed panelists. So Martine, if you don't mind, I will pass it off to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Martine Stillman, and I am the Vice President of Engineering at Synapse Product Development. I have a very deep and abiding interest in sustainability and sustainable topics, and I've been trying to guide our product development processes to include more sustainability-focused practice for the past few years. So we've created a sustainability steering committee, and we've also been generating a lot of content and centering a lot of expertise around both product development processes and materials and manufacturing best practices.
Thanks, Martine. Matthew, over to you.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's really good to be here with everyone. My name's Matthew Fiedler, and I'm CTO for Re3D. We're focused on large format industrial 3D printing. And I guess a little bit of the story that helps clue you in is that we started the company about 7 years ago as a NASA spinoff company, focused on sustainability in so much as how come we can't take this plastic waste that we see everywhere in the world and put it into a 3D printer and allow us to create technology that provides large format 3D printing in a very accessible, affordable, and a sustainable way. And at the same time, creating a lot of jobs and economic scenarios for people all around the world, especially in the developing countries. So in the last 7 years, we've been able to really do amazing things with creating a platform of a machine that accepts recycled plastic waste and allows people to solve their own problems using 3D printing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, Matthew. Erin, passing to you.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining on Earth Day. It's really great to be here. I'm Erin OMalley. I currently work as an engineering manager at a solar company, but in a previous life was fortunate to work with CADA when I was living and working in China on manufacturing, sustainability, and worker health and safety. So that was earlier in my career, and I've been lucky to be able to take those learnings as I've moved back to the US, worked in consumer electronics at a couple different companies, and now am working in a solar company, applying those same kind of design principles that I've learned earlier in my career. So yeah, thanks for joining.
And thank you. And Nicholas, over to you.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Nicolas Avril. I'm the one joining from Europe, and I'm with Dragon Innovation. I'm the VP of Europe there. By education, I studied chemistry and then material science with a focus on polymer and composites. And then I ended up spending 20 years in different factories as manufacturing engineer. And then later on, after getting, a Lean Six Sigma black belt into, quality, and quality falling into health and safety and environment. And so having a global perspective in different industries, and yeah, excited to join this panel and to learn and to share.
Wonderful. So thank you all again for joining us today. I believe our poll should be ending, and that we will be able to share the results, there they are, immediately with all of you. So recapping, looks like we've got a great, almost half of you are interested in incorporating sustainable design practices, either in your current or upcoming hardware projects. Fantastic. A lot of you just here for general knowledge, also fantastic. And then in terms of roles, wow, that's a vast majority that either has total or some influence into the choices your company makes in terms of sustainable manufacturing practices. So fantastic. To kick things off, I know I myself and many of our panelists have a strong interest in educating the companies that we work with on a variety of topics. Me, myself, I think the importance of language and untangling acronyms and that type of thing is one of the best things you can do. So for this panel, the title is Environmentally Friendly Materials. And so for my first question for our panelists is going to be around, what does that mean in terms of what is environmentally friendly? When we talk about sustainability, I think there are potentially obvious things that come to mind. I know in Scott's keynote this morning, he gave us a nice overview that in consumer electronics products, we can potentially think about paper, plastic, metal, and PCBs. But I want to ask the panel, what in your mind, when we say environmentally friendly materials, what is kind of the low-hanging fruit, what is obvious, and then what people might not be thinking about that would make a material environmentally friendly or not? So how about we reverse order? Nicholas, why don't I start with you?
Yes, it's a great question, and indeed, Scott mentioned during the keynote speech that, for instance, metal is great because it's almost infinitely, recyclable. You can reuse it to save energy. But what's important is to look at the full picture. Metal is also heavy, and because it is heavy, it's going to impact your shipping costs. And you want to take that into account. Other material with maybe similar property will require a lot more energy to process. So if you have a choice, you may want to use, environmentally friendly might mean something that uses less, energy to process. But of course, that's also dependent where you process. If you're, in a place like, the Netherlands and you buy all your electricity from wind power, yeah, there is plenty of wind, and a little bit more electricity doesn't hurt, the environment to use a little more energy there in the form of electricity. And also, and I think, maybe Matthew, you might want to explore that, but where you get your material also is also, will play a role. And Matthew, do you want to add to this?
No, I think that's an excellent point. So as we start to evaluate materials, as you said, from a very high level, you have to look at from beginning to end, right? So where did that material come from in the beginning? How long will it last in your product? Is it a good, does it survive a long time? And then how is it disposed of in the end? So as we look at that complete life cycle of the material, and to see what is the impact, what is the impact on the environment, and what is the impact on people? And that's a bit of how we look at sustainability. Can this practice be survived for 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, right? So we tend to take a very long view of sustainability. Some people may take a much more narrow view. So I think as we look at language, as Kata, you said, part of that is defining, what do we mean by sustainability? And I know we have some really very educated viewpoints here, and I want to hear more about it from some of the other panelists. One particular way that we look at, to your point, the supply chain, right? So if it's a heavy metal product and you have to transport it a long ways, so in the industrial 3D printing sector, we look at distributed manufacturing. And we primarily work with polymers as our feedstock material. So one of the influences we can have on sustainability and sustainable practices in manufacturing is if we distribute that manufacturing capability across the world. And now your supply chains become much shorter, and the impact of the supply chain and the transport cost and the associated negative effects on the environment are much smaller as well. So I think it's very important to look at the materials and the manufacturing process, as you said.
Excellent. Erin, anything in your current world or prior experience that would add to this concept of what makes something environmentally friendly? Or
So I see from the poll that a lot of people are working on developing products currently, which is really exciting. And I think that I break down how I think about sustainable materials into two buckets. So one of my hats is, how do I make what I'm designing less bad? So I've identified that I don't want to use this bad glue, this paint has a bad solvent in it. How can I use other processes or materials so that I don't need to use things that I know are harmful right off the bat? So that's one side. The other side is, how can I do more good? How can I choose materials that just by the nature of their selection are going to come from sources that I feel good about? So let's say I care a lot about recycling, and people have mentioned metal. We use a lot of aluminum in our product, and our current product, which is a solar tracker. And that, because it's all sourced domestically, I know that about 99% of that material is going to come from recycled sources, because it just economically makes sense for the feedstock to be from recycled sources. So yeah, I like to think about, what can I do? What do I have the power to do? And how can I reduce harm across the board? It doesn't just mean using, a far out there, really advanced, sustainable material that's thought of as sustainable. It's also about harm reduction for the things that have already been selected.
thank you. And Martine, potentially, a segue into a topic I know is near and dear to your heart, in terms of how you and your role consider, and I know we've got a whole panel on design for R, but in the product design, product development space, how do you approach considering what I think we've talked about in terms of cradle to grave, or cradle to cradle, or this entire life cycle. How does that impact those decisions about environmentally friendly materials?
Yeah, absolutely. To go back to the last question, I think when we talk about sustainability, we've been thinking a lot about the concept that some attendees might be familiar with, which we call the triple bottom line. So we're looking at the environmental, social, and economic impacts of these choices. And I think when we think about eco-friendly materials, it's important to think about that sort of triangle of benefits. So for example, you know, we could say, yeah, metals are a lot more sustainable than plastics. Well, in general, that might be true as an aggregate concept, but if you're talking about, you know, a conflict-based tin product, then, you know, you're starting to get into a space where that's not necessarily true. So I think it's important to sort of take that high-level view. Yeah, with regards to circularity and product development, I think this is actually a really exciting time to be developing products. It's so exciting to see so many people on this panel who are just at that stage where you're getting into developing your product. The biggest impacts can actually be seen the earlier you make those, you know, the earlier you can take sustainability into account in your product development process. You can have a much, much bigger impact if you do it earlier in the process than later. It is totally possible to take a later stage and also have some really significant benefits. But if you can really do it at that that architecture phase, when you're thinking about the concept of the product and its ecosystem, you can have a lot bigger impact on both the circularity of the whole product and your materials selection choices as you go along through the product. So I think it's both a really exciting time to be developing products in that we have more recycled content available to us, and we have a greater understanding of what impacts to the environment some materials can have. And we also have a lot greater range. Like we have more recycled plastics than we've ever had before, recycled metal availability, as Erin said. We have a greater number of compounds that are growing. So it used to be if you wanted to choose an eco-friendly plastic, you were stuck with, you know, a hideous color of HDPE and that was all you got, right? Or you were scrapping along with some polypropylene with bad characteristics. I think, you know, the world is expanding in the areas of materials development. So it's really exciting to see those developments. And this is a great time to be considering circularity. Yeah, so we are continuously trying to incorporate that into more and more of our design practices. The earlier you can do that and start thinking about that sort of disassembly or possibility for reuse, the better the product development can be.
Thank you. I'd actually love to use that to dig in a little bit more to the area of plastics in general. And Matthew, I might kick it to you initially. I know you touched a bit upon, you know, your global network in terms of using materials and substrates in the 3D printing. I still remember, you know, in my first months at Dragon, I got an inbound question from a potential customer about wanting to use recycled ocean plastic in their devices. And in asking our engineers, you know, why is this not feasible? A lot of it had to do with having a sustainable supply. So ocean plastic is not necessarily always going to be available at the same quality. But I remember it sparked this thought about, you know, where the materials come from. And then I think there's also some about the integrity and the rigidity of plastics, but would love it if you might kick things off in terms of digging a bit more into that sphere of plastics and related materials in that front.
For sure. No, and the first thing I'll say is I'm not a chemist, so there's definitely a limit to what I can speak to as we get into the details of it. But going back to the ocean plastic, it's very interesting as this has become more and more of a known issue and people are caring more about this, which they rightly should, because it is really a large problem that we're facing collectively. And that I've actually seen a lot where they've increased the scope of ocean plastic to not only pertain to that which directly comes out of the ocean, but any plastic within a certain distance of a waterway. So if you can say that plastic perhaps is in a manufacturing facility that is located close to a waterway where potentially it could end up in the ocean, that is still considered an ocean plastic. So some of the real early and easy wins for our customers is to be able to recycle that plastic waste that maybe comes out of a manufacturing facility. And that as this opens up the scope of materials that are available for that supply stream, right? So as we look at how do we get a steady supply of good known material to put into our product that we're creating, a really key source of that is materials, waste materials, scrap or trim coming out of a manufacturing facility that is more clean, more known, sorted, and more easily reused to be able to recycle that into your end product. Now, touching upon the base and getting a little bit into the chemistry side of it, any manufacturing process needs to be repeatable, and it needs to be of a known quality, right? So you're worried about that input material and how consistent it is. And what's interesting is about regaining a lot of the strength that is lost in recycling plastic. So there's a lot of good research happening right now at different additives and different ways of processing that material. In fact, we're doing quite a bit with a few different suppliers around the world that are rejuvenating the strength of plastic, or even making it more suitable to your application. So perhaps you start with an HDPE or a PET material, but through the chemistry, through the wonder of science, we're able to modify the material properties just slightly to give you a better product that's more usable for your application. So there is like a ton of headroom in the chemistry side. There's new advancements happening all the time on the polymer side that's allowing us to tailor these materials and make more unique and boutique materials for your application through different additives and different processing techniques. So really do look at that as a source of recycled material as you're evaluating what am I going to make my product out of.
And Nicholas, along those lines, I mean, a lot of what Matthew's talking about potentially requires the folks on your team who are in operations, supply chain, manufacturing, potentially even to, you know, have input from material scientists. Are there some areas or learnings you can share about, you know, how do I get started, or how do I approach this topic without having a PhD in material science, for example?
Yes, and I think Martine said it, you know, very accurately. You know, you want to think about it early. If you design your product to work only with a virgin, you know, polyethylene, it's going to be very difficult to, you know, come and accept that, you know, something that would have, you know, impurity. So, you know, think about it early. The other thing is, it's not an all or nothing. It's fine, you know, if we use ocean plastic or if you use scrap material and you run out of it, well, what does it mean for your business? Does it mean you stop producing? It doesn't mean that. You know, there are ways to source and to create, you know, polymers out of, you know, biomass that are more sustainable, that are, you know, more respectful of the environment. Now, it's not, you know, because it comes from biomass, and there's a big misconception about bioplastic. Coming from, you know, from plants, you can make a plastic that's completely not recyclable. Actually, only half of the plastic that are made from biomass, so half of the biopolymers, are compostable or recyclable. The other are just, and it's just plastic. It's just the raw material differs. So you know, think about that. The other thing is, think about incorporating, again, this not like all or nothing. Think about incorporating some natural, renewable, or sustainable material into your component. So I know I've heard of companies that are making filaments for 3D printers that contain fibers from hemp. And you still get, you know, 20 or 30% of, you know, your good old regular material that can be, but 80% now comes from, you know, byproduct, or comes from, you know, plants that capture the, you know, the carbon dioxide, and that makes your product 80% better. That's already a great win. And maybe to finish off on the bio, plastic and why, what's their advantage, and I'm writing, a blog about it, is the biggest advantage is capture, you don't take out of the ground some, fossil fuels and, carbon that has been cut into the oil, and then you're going to release it 4 years later because your product is destroyed or burnt. You grow plants, the plants capture the carbon then is made into plastic, and then this carbon, well, if it ends up going back into the environment, it's a short, cycle. The other one comes to, you can grow it, closer to where you want. But it's that's what makes it interesting, and there's also other aspects.
Thank you.
Nicholas, I just want to follow up. That's a really good point about adding the biomass into the raw material and making it a more sustainable product. They're doing that with hemp and coconut fiber and a lot of other natural cellulose materials. There's also a lot of research coming out about the lignin-based additives that are improving the mechanical structure and the mechanical properties of these materials quite a bit. And then the last bit of research that I saw come out recently is on the natural monomers. So they're looking at the polymer base, the monomer structures that are much more easily broken down and recycled. So even within the world of plastics, from the base material to the additives, there's a lot of greening going on, shall we say, or a lot of alternative ways of manufacturing and usability that makes a much better sustainable product.
Yeah, and kind of expanding on that point, Matthew, I guess really on what everyone has said, if you start early in the design process incorporating these thoughts, it also gives you a unique opportunity to work early with suppliers who may be developing something more on an R&D phase and are actually looking for a company like many of you are a part of to be the people who bring that to market. They're always looking for that killer application that they can, deploy something new. And then you can be the first group to show other people, hey, this is possible and this is how we use this. Because often companies develop things and they don't exactly know how they're going to be deployed or rolled out in the world and what product is going to use them and be the killer application. And that could be your product. So, I think there's a lot of great partnerships that I've seen and that I've worked on in the past to try to both push product development forward, but also push these suppliers forward who are working on a lot of these really interesting new materials.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and mention, I think it can feel a little overwhelming when we talk about these new materials. For me, when I was a design engineer, it felt like, how can I possibly find these things? How can I engage with this world that I don't have as much experience as I would like to have? And I just wanted to touch that there are a few tools that are really coming out and developing, which are starting to build these massive databases of information about which choices might be most sustainable. And so if you're in that space where this sounds so exciting, but you feel like it might be really difficult to engage, the life cycle assessment, which I think we'll talk about later, has some great tools. So there's the Granta software is a great one for choosing materials. There's a company called Ecolyzer, which is making some wonderful tables about different materials choices, guidance. There's also a company called Sustainable Minds, which has an LCA tool that people can use. We're making a custom lightweight one that we are using for early product development. And so all of those draw on these big databases that have been developed by experts that you can rely on as a designer. So you don't have to, be pouring through huge tomes of data in order to find some good solutions. So if that's helpful for people, we'll be sending out some more information, I think, after this.
That's a wonderful point, and I'd actually love to use that to transition more into, let's talk about LCA. So actually, Martine, if you don't mind, I might pass it back to you. Would you mind defining what LCA is for the folks who are listening in, and then expanding a little bit about, how does one employ those tools? At what stage should one consider those tools? How does it apply to the whole product development? Well, let's call it the entire, cradle to grave life cycle, and what can it do for you?
Yeah, great. So life cycle assessments. So LCA is a 3-letter acronym that stands for life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is a way where you use a specific tool, a life cycle assessment tool. You put in everything you know so far about your product, and it can allow you to see the impacts that your product might have on sort of a variety of different scales. So it can tell you things about your energy usage, your water usage, and your materials choices, and the impacts that those will have on the environment. So it's a really powerful way for you to be able to make adjustments in your design process and to say, what if I switched to, what if I were able to make this one part much more lightweight? What if I were able to use a smaller battery or a larger battery? What if I wanted it to be run with a solar charger instead of plugging it into the wall? You can make those choices and you can sort of see those things change. It's also a great way to see proportionally what has the biggest impact. A lot of our clients are often interested in that the manufacturer of the PCB that goes into their consumer electronic device usually has a hugely disproportionately large impact environmentally in their product. So they think like, oh, I'm gonna use a recycled plastic for this housing, and that's gonna make my product very eco-friendly. Well, it turns out, if you're still using conflict minerals, if you're still using this really challenging PCB, then you might not be having as big an impact as you think. So life cycle assessment is a great way to see proportionally those different areas. There are a bunch of different life cycle assessment tools. There are some out on the market that are much more in-depth. So SEMA Pro is a good industry standard one. And then there are some that are either free for use or a more lightweight tools. So there's one called Sustainable Minds. Synapse and our parent company Cambridge has been developing one for use in sort of early product development. We're calling it Up in the Air, and we will be releasing that on our website, I think today, maybe, actually, very exciting. And that'll be available for people's use as well. Again, that's designed to help you just have a little bit more information and to see these sort of proportional pictures, not to give you every piece of information, but to sort of point you in the right direction. So LCA is also exciting in that it can help you see things like we've talked about transport. It can help you just like keep an eye on the proportional effects of transport and energy usage. And also it can sometimes allow you to talk about those locational differences in materials sourcing. So if you get recycled metal from one location versus virgin metal from a conflict location, you could have vastly different impacts there. So I think life cycle assessment is a hugely powerful tool, and it's a great place for people to start to see sort of the whole picture of the sustainability of their product.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really good point that if you're making a really big impact by making sustainable choices or environmentally friendly choices in one area, wanting to make sure that that's still, going to be making a 90% difference in your product rather than, we've made a 90% difference, but in only 2% of the overall product. Nicholas, you had something to add there, I think.
Yeah, just if you can, Martine, touch base a little bit on how the life cycle assessment takes into account the difference in how your product is going to be used. For instance, if you're making a water boiler, most of the energy and the impact is going to be during use, while if you're making, buying a solar panel, that, it's during production of the solar. That comes into play, or?
Yes, generally it does. And also it sort of depends on the tool. So if you're using one of the more detailed ones, then that is taken into account. And this is actually a great place where you can actually see the life cycle of your product can have a huge impact here. So in the more detailed life cycle assessment tools, you can say, I'm making a coffee maker and I'm designing this coffee maker to be used for a year and then be thrown out, or 3 years and then be recycled. And you can see the difference in benefit for the extended life. In some cases, if you have a year and then everything can be recycled, or 5 years and you throw it away, you may actually see greater impacts with the extended life of your product. And so that can be really important when you're thinking about things like testing and reliability and robustness of your parts, right? It may be worth it to invest in those things because you'll be seeing these interesting ecological benefits by just extending that life.
I also think it's important to consider we can do, I think life cycle assessment is a really great way to wrap your mind around where some impacts of your product could be. But we also have to remember that products don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the hands of consumers. And while it might be great if every component that you make can be recycled, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be treated in the way that you as the designer or someone conceptualizing a product has imagined. And I always just like to do a little bit of research every year about what plastic recycling rates are and what the rate of recycling is for different materials to kind of ground myself in reality, and then also kind of keep up to date with what's actually happening in the world. Because currently with the situation specifically, I'll talk about recycling, with what's happening between the US and China, we don't have a market for a lot of these materials that we're using. So while it might be great that they technically can be recycled, a lot of things are ending up in landfill anyway. So, keeping that in mind might make you make different decisions around how long your product lasts versus, kind of like Martine was saying, versus, just the materials that are in there.
Certainly with less than 20% of all plastic ever having been recycled, that's very much a valid point. I think also, and Martine, on the life cycle analysis, the material choice for sustainability affects your manufacturing methods as well. So if you choose one material versus another material, that may change your manufacturing process, which also has a big impact on your footprint as well. And honestly, that's one of the reasons some people move towards additive, especially for small volume manufacturing processes. Recently we just completed an order of 10,000 items and we printed them in a week, right? So it's not just 1 or 5 or 10 or 100, but you can actually approach some of those mass manufacturing numbers using an additive process, which has very low electricity requirements, very low overhead as far as manufacturing goes, and very low waste. So as you look at the material and trying to choose a material that's more sustainable, you also have to think about the implicating the manufacturing process with your material choice as well.
Yeah, and as Nicola was saying about energy usage in different countries, right? Like if you are doing a wonderful, very eco-friendly bamboo material, but it takes a ton of energy to make, and that energy is coal energy, you could be making the situation worse. So LCA is a nice tool in that it generally tries to account for a lot of those things behind the scenes as you run those analyses, using data that was collected by other experts.
Thank you. And just to state out loud, there were a bunch of really great resources that were mentioned, particularly by Martine, but some of the other panelists as well. So we will post a list of those with the follow-up of this on-demand recording. So stay tuned for that if you weren't able to write them down. We'll have that information available to you. I'd love to transition or switch gears briefly. At Dragon, we often talk about the manufacturing triangle, so the confluence of costs, quality, and schedule. And I'd love to hear from our panelists, how does sustainability apply here? I know many of us live in capitalist systems where, I guess, as Erin said, we're not designing products in a vacuum. Someone has to want to use them and someone has to pay money for them. Scott mentioned in his keynote that he believes, eventually there will be a path where people will pay more money for products that are sustainable. But I'd love to hear, particularly on the cost driver side, I think, of this triangle, are there ever instances where making sustainable choices are also the most cost-effective choices overall? This is talking throughout life cycle. And what are your various experiences on that front? And Nicholas, maybe we'll start with you if that works.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So it is a balancing act, right? Cost, quality, schedule. Early, you define the quality you want, and the cost. I'd like to maybe take a step back and are you looking at the cost, just the financial cost of acquiring the product, or are you looking also at the cost, the impact it's going to have on the user's on the user, it's most likely safe, right? Because we have enough, certification body that make sure that, you don't hurt your own health. But what about, the user's grandchildren? What the cost, to your user's grandchildren? If so, this is, to take the big picture. It's not necessarily more expensive as far as, if we look at just the cost, the dollars or euros that you want to spend. You might win, somewhere and lose somewhere, right? So you might save. We see that often when European companies are trying to look at where to manufacture, and you could manufacture, in China, you could manufacture in Europe, you could manufacture, in the US if you're an American company, and the labor costs are going to be higher if you're in Europe or in the US versus China, but your shipping costs are going to be, less. And on top of it, if you look at your cash flow, your product is not going to be tied up for 5 weeks, in a ship. So, you need to look at, I want to say, take the total cost of ownership, the total cost of building, and look at it and add to it, to make it more complicated, the cost, the social, cost, and and the ethical cost. Do you want to have product that comes from these suspicious areas of the world?
I have a case study that I love to talk about where sustainability and cost reduction actually really runs hand in hand. We had a scenario where we were actually trying to do a cost down effort, and it wound up actually winning a sustainability award because what we wound up doing was reducing part count. We reduced the weight of a lot of the components. We reduced the amount of plastic that we were using, and they combined the housing into part of the packaging. So it actually wound up being an interesting packaging solution as well. And all of those choices were, also sustainable choices, right? So I think there are a lot of times where if you launch a sustainability improvement effort, you can actually see some cost benefits come out if you do it in a smart way. So I think it's really great when those things track together. Again, the earlier you can do it, the less you can make it a bolt-on retrofit at the end. I think sometimes if we can embrace a little bit longer time and a little bit more cost in the development cycle, and we can say, okay, we're going to do a sustainability design spin here to try and do what we can, then you can see those costs come out later.
Yeah, I would also say for balancing cost, quality, and schedule, it's also good to spend a little bit of time thinking before you start developing your product, or really now, wherever you are, about what is your minimum requirement. Like if you're making a product and you go visit the factory and you see something that's unsafe or unhealthy for people or the environment, how are you going to respond to that situation? And what is your baseline level of acceptability there? Like I can remember being on the line in China working on a number of different products, and because it was my product that I was working on, I knew personally myself what I was okay having my name associated with, and I won't let their line run if I see unsafe things happening that are either going to be a potential harm to the environment. Maybe the wastewater I see is not being treated well in a factory. That's a no-go for me. I won't work with that factory until either they've gotten it fixed or we found a different factory that has a better way of treating the environment. So I think balancing those things, it's good to know what your minimum threshold level is, and then you can really just work up from there. And that I would just encourage everyone to think about the power that they do have to improve every kind of aspect of what you're working on. And I think people have more power than they think throughout the product design process to really improve things, whether they're small or large.
I think most of our listeners are already tuned into the fact that sustainability by definition means, we're looking at this on the long term, right? So what is your cost over the long term, to Nicholas's point? And if we are solely focused about our upfront cost, the true cost of that product is not in the shelf price, right? There's a true environmental cost that's spread over the whole world on some of these products that are manufactured in multiple different places and shipped to multiple other different places. So we have to think about what is the true cost of that product and not just the shelf price. And I am really heartened by the fact that many companies, large companies, are looking at it, their chief sustainability officer is looking at it from long term and knowing that their shareholders are very interested in sustainability. And so we're not just going to look, it's that triple bottom line. It's not just the bottom line of the cost, but we're getting a much better awareness. And I would also extend that all the way out to, say you're making a product as an entrepreneur or as a small business, those investors that you are potentially inviting into the conversation to look at your company, they are putting a lot more promise on sustainably manufactured, sustainably produced products as well, because that company will innately perform better. And it's been shown in studies that companies that focus on sustainability, not just on the bottom line, bottom dollar price, are going to last longer as companies, and they will have a bigger market share. So you all the way from the chief sustainability officer to potential investors are turning an eye towards sustainability and saying, okay, we need to weight this a little bit more than just making an inexpensive product.
Thank you all. I realize I would love to keep going for a long time, but we have some really great questions in our Q&A that I think may spark some other great information for our attendees here. So would love to start digging through those a little bit. There was a question here about packaging, which was an area I don't think we have covered in quite as much depth as I'd like this esteemed panel to talk about. Scott mentioned in his keynote that we are observing a trend in companies using less packaging. And that's everything from those blister packs, which also I think caused a lot of injuries when people used to open them, to switching to more less complicated materials and potentially, you know, more recyclable materials on that front. So I will find the question that was specifically about packaging. Here we go. I was thinking of making my product enclosure with cardboard and itself serving as packaging. Is this a good path to pursue? Meaning it won't be invisible to the consumer once installed. So either using that specific question or talking about some of the trends you've observed in packaging changes would be great. Matthew, maybe I'll pass it to you to kick off.
Yeah, sure. I can tell you one thing that really kills sustainability in packaging is multi-material packaging that's difficult to recycle. So if we look at foil packs and as we look at different materials that are not easily separatable, so packaging is usually, almost always, used very temporarily, right? Once you receive your product, then the packaging goes into the waste or the recycling. And so in order to make that packaging more sustainable, one thing you want to do is make sure that it's easily broken down and separated into its core components that you can either reuse or recycle, right? If you could reuse it, that's great. If you want to recycle it, that's good as well. So look at the design of your packaging and the selection of your packaging materials and how is that packaging constructed so that it has an easy end of life and a good program for that. A couple of the things our customers are doing on the additive front is, again, using recycled plastic waste from their manufacturing process and diverting that from the landfill and diverting that from the ocean, and actually using that to 3D print the packaging material as well, especially for larger containers where you don't need the critical strength, or maybe the color's off a little bit. Some of those things are less critical. I think that customers are okay with that, knowing that you source your packaging material well.
And I also think for packaging, it's important to consider all of the steps of packaging. I think one step that often gets overlooked is that when your unit ships out to the final consumer, it might be put into like a bubble bag, or, you know, you think about what you get from Amazon, for example. So if there's a way you can develop like a ship in its own container type packaging where you just can stick the label right on the packaging that you've designed, and maybe your third-party logistics facility can do that for you. I think that's another really good way to prevent additional waste in the packaging of your product. there's already standards that exist for ship in its own container style packaging. So you can very easily test to those and make sure that your product's going to survive that shipping process.
So next question from the audience, Peter Haas asks, making an IoT device avoiding plastic, using wood and metal, but I'm struggling with the compute core. Is the best I can do an off-the-shelf SBC that could be reused? Are there SBCs that are easier to recycle than others? Do we have any experts here on SBCs? Or does someone want to define what SBC is?
Single board computer, probably. But I'm not an expert in recycling electronics, so.
I can talk a little bit about that. So I guess I'm not sure about recycling of off-the-shelf SBCs. Yes, reuse would be good. And it's possible that you would just be able to use an off-the-shelf SBC that could then be easily reused. I think that would be a great option if it was something that was common enough that it could be leveraged in a similar product later or re-leveraged in the same product. That would be a great choice. We see a lot of challenge with electronics and electronic components, and the sourcing of all of those is extremely difficult. So again, we keep looking at extending the lifetime of using that product can help reduce the environmental impact there. So extending the life, reusing if possible, and trying to do the best that you can to get some industry standard best suppliers for environmentally friendly electronics is all really important there.
Thank you. We have a question. How can I find or define suitable eco-design principles for our product? Portable battery power supply, I think, is the example that's used.
Yeah, and I saw another couple questions later on about LCA. So again, we're gonna send out an email after this with some of those resources to help point you towards how you can do LCA yourself. But yes, portable battery power supply, batteries are a challenge when it comes to sustainability, the chemicals they're in. I think if you're designing that yourself, it's a little unclear. If you're designing that yourself, an LCA could really be helpful, but finding an off-the-shelf one may be a little bit of a challenge. So.
For power supplies specifically, there's certain minimum efficiency requirements that you need to hit, but that's actually not a ceiling to how efficient you need to be. So I think you can also be considerate and, can I change a few components and make my, power supply more efficient? So that's something that, over the use of your product would actually have a big impact.
Yeah, energy.
Thank you. Jumping around a little bit here, there's a question about policy, and I think the question here is a bit specific in terms of how do you feel about policy that pushes towards more sustainable ways. Specifically here, since as competitive companies will always be pushed for being price competitive as well, and thus potentially not going for the better way, even though idealistically they would want to go the sustainable route. Nicholas, I know you've done a bit of research, or a little bit at least initially, into various policies here. Want to take a stab at potentially some of the good that's coming out of these types of initiatives?
Yes, so we all know the energy label that comes into when you buy an appliance, and it will tell you how good your appliance is, and how much energy it's gonna use, when you use it. You could be thinking about creating some sort of overview, a pie chart that shows how recyclable on one end, your product is, and how much shipping was involved, and the impacts, of the different products, of where it came from, and so having this will already give knowledge, give information, so that because ultimately who buys the product, we are buying the products. So if we choose to ignore the, more and environmentally responsible choice, then yes, those products stand no chance. I think, and hopefully, and I believe we are, as humans, slowly realizing that we have to do something, that, we can mine and create, material that are going to be there for generation, and we're using them only so that we're not doing good for ourselves and for future generations. So I do believe first, information and the policies in that case can requiring people bringing new product to market that could potentially harm the environment to display or to run a life cycle analysis could be a step in the right direction. Without it would be extremely difficult to put a carbon tax or something like this on products, but to give information to people and to require that information, similar to when you buy some food and you have how much protein and fat is in there. Give information to people, trust that the people who can will make an informed decision.
Okay. Anyone else seeing good trends in this state, and there's a sort of a similar question, are there eco-friendly certifications for physical products that we should strive for or that already exist?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So the REACH certification is a great, REACH has a list of materials that are more and less eco-friendly. So I think that's a great way to go. There is a cradle to cradle certification, which I think is largely focused around soft goods, but may also be interesting. I think those are all also just starting to grow, right? I think this is an exciting time because we're seeing more and more certifications. For woods, we're starting to see the FSC certified wood products are, something that you can really rely on to make sure that you're making smart choices. So I think it's important to acknowledge that policy has already pushed us in in many more sustainable ways, right? We're not using DDT. We don't, there are a lot of ways in which policy has improved there, but I think we will continue to see those pushes drive us forward. In energy policy too is also becoming a really powerful motivator in manufacturing.
And of course, this is we are at the beginning of it. We talk about wood. You can look at a plastic bottle made of PE. I mean, yeah, it's a single material. Maybe you have that's easy. When you're talking about a consumer electronics product, when you have metal, glass, plastic, it's going to take a while, and I don't think that policymakers can make a rule for each product is so unique. So at the material level, that's where we are starting, and that's where it has to start.
Thank you. I want to wrap up here. I apologize, we're not going to get to answer all of the questions. I want to note that we can follow up directly afterwards for those more complicated or personalized questions. So do feel free to reach out to us if you'd like a follow-up answer. I want to ask a last question of the panel here, and apologize to put you all on the spot, but is there a current product that you admire, whether you own it or not, that makes good use of current sustainable materials? Give you a minute to think about it. If anyone has one in mind and wants to jump in first, please feel free.
I can jump in first. I wouldn't say this is a sustainable material product, but does take into consideration the principles that I consider reflect sustainability. So I would just say my Dyson vacuum. You can clean everything yourself. There's no components that need to be swapped in and become waste. Everything is just contained within the device itself. So that's sort of something that I think of as a sustainable product and a huge leap forward from where we were prior to that being on the market.
I would say that it's not perhaps a mass produced product, but in general, as I look at products that I admire a lot, they tend to be more of the handmade and low volume production. And I think that when people put that much love and skill and labor into the things that they make a lot of conscious decisions about the processes, the materials, and so forth. So maybe it's not one particular product, but it's trying to utilize some of that love and the energy that people do for handcrafted products as I look at mass production products, and try to use some of those same thought processes and some of those informed decisions as I go to manufacture a product. So maybe it's more of a method rather than a particular product.
I've been really encouraged by, in Seattle, and this is a great example of policy change. In Seattle, we have a really big push against single-use plastics. And I've been really encouraged to see all of the compostable plastics that have been coming out of places where I used to get single-use plastics. So that's been really exciting. In most places where you get food and beverage in Seattle these days, you're using either a recyclable or, I mean, at minimum a recyclable, but usually a compostable cup, lid, straw, fork, spoon, like all of that I think is a huge leap forward, and that's been really exciting. That's a great example of where Seattle said this is the policy, and now every single, you know, deliverer of food is doing that. So I think that's really exciting. I also received a pair of Apple AirPods lately, and the packaging has changed really significantly. They're using 0 stickers. They're using an all interlocking cardboard packaging design so they can make that as recyclable as possible. And I was just really impressed to see those steps forward being taken to make that as easy as possible. Nike has also done a great push forward in sustainability of their shoes. And I think actually, like, you know, Flyknit is a sneaker that I've worn for a long time. They've moved to a 60%, I think, recyclable content. So things like that are also, you know, it's exciting to see those industry trends moving in that direction.
Nicholas?
Yes, we're running out of time, but I'm going to say, at the risk of sounding old-fashioned, a bicycle that is all repairable. It's been there for a long time, but we don't have to get a new bicycle every 2 years, and yeah, keeps on going.
Replace the parts. Mm-hmm.
You can replace the parts, a non-electric bicycle.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for letting me go 2 minutes over time. I would really like to give a warm round of applause. Do it in your own virtual living room. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. We, again, can follow up on specific questions. It's been amazing to have your expertise. Logistically, our next panel starts in a half hour, so I hope you will all join us there. That topic is on design for R, so reuse, repair, and recyclability. So we'll be diving a bit more into those types of topics that I know this panel touched upon. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, and look forward to being in touch soon. Happy Earth Day.
Bye.
Nice.